room today. How are you children all doing this morning? Good. It's nice to see you here. It's good for me to be here too. I was enjoying the sun before we came in. I was warming up in it for a little bit, and now I'm in here and I'm cold again. So this maybe will help me be a little bit nervous up here and get me shaking so I can warm up a little bit. Well, before we even start, I just wanted to meditate on that song a little bit. Christ the Solid Rock. What a beautiful song. Do you know what that song's about? Do you know who the solid rock is? Yeah? Jesus, that's right. It starts off, it says, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness." And that's the hope that we have. That's the only true hope that we have. You know, it's so easy for people to trust in other things than Jesus. It's very easy to get distracted and forget that Jesus is our only hope. It says in the chorus, it says, "On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand." You know, all the other things that we can think that we can trust in that will be good enough, none of it's ever going to be good enough. But this song reminds us that it's Christ and Christ alone. He is the solid rock. The second verse says, "When darkness seems to veil his face." Do you know what that's talking about? That's talking about when times are really hard. You know, when it seems like you're all alone and there's not a lot of people there to help. You know, Christ is there to help. When we put our faith in him, when we trust him, he's there to take us through those times. And that's why we stand on him. And that's why he is our only hope. And without him, we are lost. You know, Christ is a solid rock, and he is our firm foundation. Do you know what a foundation is, children? A foundation is something why don't you tell me? Exactly. It's the really strong, firm part of a house that holds the rest of it up. So if you were going to put a foundation on something really weak or soft, like if you put a foundation on a bunch of just soggy marsh or something like that. If you built a nice big solid foundation in a marsh, you know what's going to happen? It's just going to tilt and crack and your whole house is going to fall down. But you know, Christ is not a weak foundation. Christ was not built on marsh or on sand. He is the rock. And when we build our foundation on him, then we're sure. Then we know that our foundation won't break apart if our foundation is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. But we're going to read about somebody in Genesis today who did not build his foundation on the rock. He did not build his foundation on something sure. He did not make his building of something strong. And we're going to start in Genesis chapter 10. We're probably going to look in chapter 10 and chapter 11 for a little bit. And we're going to discover who this person is. We're actually going to be looking at quite a few things. But I'm just going to read in chapter 9, verse 28 for a second. It said, "And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died." Goodness me, he was an old man, wasn't he? 950 years old? He was a very, very old man. Now, did you know before the flood, most people lived that old, like 900 or a little older than that. That's how long they all lived. We don't live that long now, do we? You know, something happened between then and now that changed that. And, you know, we don't know exactly what it is, but we're going to see if we can discover a little bit about that today as we read these verses. And we're going to go on. I want you to remember that, okay? I need you kids to remember how old Noah was. We're going to need that information. So, chapter 10, verse 1. "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood." So, how many sons did Noah have? That's right. Noah had 3 sons, and unto them were sons born. And it talks about a few of the names of his sons. And it says in verse 5, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." So from Noah and his sons, you know, all the world was populated. All the people that we see in the whole world came from Noah and his sons. Now, there's something that I was reading this and it didn't quite make sense, and a lot of people have questions about this. In verse 5, it's talking about how the Gentiles were divided, how the land was divided, and it says it was divided everyone after his tongue. Do you know what it means when it's talking about tongues, children? Yes? That's right, their language. Now, when Noah was on the ark with his sons, how many languages did you think there were? Do you think there was 8 people on the ark? Did you think each one of them spoke their own language, or maybe multiple languages? How many languages were there, yeah? One. We got lots of interaction over here. This is good. You girls are paying attention. Maybe I'll get to you yet, Lucy. They had one language. They all spoke one language. So how come in a few verses in verse 5, it's talking about a lot of different languages? Something had to happen. Now, it's actually going to end up being a bit of a Bible lesson and a math lesson. Now, I know a lot of you children probably were hoping to leave math for school, but I'm going to need your help. We're going to have to do a little bit of math. So do you children know what a generation is? Yeah, a generation? What is it?
When kids have kids and they have kids.
That's a perfect answer. When kids have kids and they have kids. So when the kids' kids have kids. And that's what we're going to follow through some of the generations. That's what generations are. So we're going to have to start at generation number 1. So generation number 1 here was Noah. So he's generation number 1. So Noah's sons were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So which generation were his sons? Does anyone know which generation his sons were? If we're starting from Noah, yeah? The second, that's right. Now, we're going to find out one of his sons, Japheth, he had sons. Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. Now, which generation would that be? Yes, that's right. The third generation. So Noah's sons is the third generation. Now that's Noah's grandchildren. Now, after this, one of his sons, it's always hard to point them in the middle of the verses. There's a whole bunch of names and you just got to find the one. But in verse 4, it's talking about Noah's son. It says, and the sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, and Kittim, and Dodanim. Strange names, right? So which generation were these? Yes? The fourth generation. The fourth generation. So now at the fourth generation, that's where we are now, the fourth generation. So Noah is the first, and we're at the fourth generation. And it says, at this time, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided. Did you know that? At the fourth generation is where the land was all really divided up. Before that, the Bible actually seems to suggest that they were pretty close together. And that's when they were divided in their lands and their tongues and their families. So before that, you know they had one tongue. We're going to get to read a little more about that later. But we're going to try and remember these things as we go forward. Now we're going to look in verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, Canaan, and the sons of Cush. Well, we won't get too far here. Now, when we were talking about Noah's sons weren't all good, were they? They weren't all good men. Do you remember which one of his sons was not good? Who did something bad? Yes?
Sam.
That's right. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the one who was a bit of a peeping Tom. He wasn't a very good fella. And because he was not, we don't know a lot of the details about what happened, but whatever he did, Noah cursed him, and he cursed his descendants, and he blessed Shem and Japheth. Now we're looking at Ham. We're actually looking at the bad son and his descendants. Now, as we read about it, we're going to hear some names of people and nations that we hear about in the rest of the Bible. And I want you to think about, when you remember these names, when you hear these names in the Bible, are they generally good or bad? Think about that as we look at some of these names. I'm going to skip through and get to a little bit of it. But just keep that in your mind as we go forward. Well, one of Ham's sons was Cush. Now we're going to read in verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. That's a bit of a strange name, isn't it? Now Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now when you read just that, it sounds like Nimrod's a pretty good dude, right? It sounds like he's kind of a cool guy, just a hunter, and he's hunting before the Lord. But you know, when we look at him in the rest of the scripture, it doesn't talk about him very much. But especially in the next chapter, we find out that Nimrod, he wasn't particularly a good man. It says in verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. So this Nimrod, this mighty hunter before the Lord, he had a kingdom, and his kingdom was Babel, or Babel. Have you guys heard about that kingdom before? Yeah? You know, it turns out that that was the first empire after the flood. So it wasn't just a little kingdom, it was actually a big kingdom. It talks about it being Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. It's like a bunch of kingdoms in one. That's called an empire. So he had the first empire, and it was in the land of Shinar. And out of that land went forth Asher, and he builded Nineveh. You remember Nineveh? And do you know, was that a good city or a bad city? You know, there was one point in time where Jonah went and preached righteousness to that city. And then they repented. It was actually kind of a special moment in the Bible. But you know, through basically the rest of the Bible, that city is quite evil. They did a lot of wickedness. And that was a descendant of which son? Was it the good sons or the bad sons? Who are we talking about? Yeah? That's right. This is a descendant of Ham. He's got, already we're finding out he's got some pretty nasty kingdoms that came from him. So he builded Nineveh. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. Verse 13. Now this is talking about some of the descendants of Ham still. And Mizraim begat Ludum and Ananim and Lehebim and Naphtahim and Pathrusim and Kazlahim. These names are pretty hard to say, I bet you can tell, eh, boys? A little bit tough to say these names, but now it says Calsahim, out of whom came Philistim. Philistim, that's a strange name. Is there anyone in the Bible that you think that maybe like a nation that would sound like that name? Can anyone pick that one out? We'll see if anyone else can guess. Yeah, Lucy, you want to have a try? No one can think of it other than we got a lot of good answers here. Lucas, what do you got? The Philistines. That's right. Did you know Calsahim, he had a son named Philistim. It tells us a little bit more about this in 1 Chronicles. But out of Philistim came the Philistines. Now, who knows who was one of the main enemies of the Israelites?
Goliath.
Well, Goliath was, but what was Goliath? What country was he from? What nation was he from? Yeah? The Philistines. So not only is Nineveh and Babel from Ham, but also the Philistines came from Ham. All the Canaanites, as a matter of fact, came from Ham. And the Canaanites were the enemies of the Israelites. Now, verse 15. Well, you know, we're just going to skip ahead a little bit. We're going to go down to verse 19. This is still talking about Ham and his descendant, and it says, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom, and Gomorrah, and Admah, and Zeboim, even unto Laish. Now, was there a couple names in there that you kids recognized, that your children recognized? Yeah? That's right. Even more cities. We know Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for their wickedness. They were terribly wicked people. Now, all these nations came from Ham when he was the one that God cursed. We're going to skip down a little bit. Now we're in verse 21. It says, unto Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even unto him were born children. So now we're talking about Shem. This is one of the good sons again. Now we're going to skip down. There's a lot of names here, and there's not a lot of interesting thing that's happening in these next couple of verses, but there's one verse in particular that's really interesting that we want to pay attention to. Verse 25, it says, and unto Eber, this is one of Shem's descendants, were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. Now that's a strange verse. You know, in most of the genealogies where it's talking about names, we don't hear a lot of things like this. But it says the earth was divided. What could that mean? That's a very interesting phrase, isn't it? Do you know what the name means? Peleg means the division. So, you know, something happened in the earth. It was divided during that time. You know, we don't know what it is, but something happened. And we're going to discover a little bit more about how that affected the people later on. We're going to skip down. There's some more names until verse 32. It says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So from these men came all the people that we see. Now in verse 11, boys, you're going to want to pay attention. This is pretty interesting. We're talking about kingdoms here. It's pretty serious business. Now, in verse 11 it says, and the whole earth was of one language. Do you remember we talked about that? So this has to be before the fourth generation that we're talking about, right? Or during that time. Turns out it's during that time of the fourth generation. And they were of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So all the people, it sounds like they were together, and they're coming from the east. Now, I've got to orientate myself. That's north, that's east. So the people were coming from this way, and they're heading this way. Now, and when they were going this way, they found the plain of Shinar. I guess it must have been a pretty neat place, because they decided, this is where we're going to start building. We're going to build in the plain of Shinar. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime for mortar. So they're going to build, and they used brick. They were going to bake some mud for bricks and use slime for mortar. Who knows what mortar is? See if anyone, you girls are just being great. You're paying attention. It's awesome, but we'll give somebody else a chance. Rachel? Or Raquel, I'm sorry. Raquel, I knew it. Raquel, go ahead. That's right. So when you lay a layer of bricks, first you put it on your foundation, right? But then you lay a layer of bricks, and you have to put something in between so they stick together. That's mortar. And they used slime. They used slime for mortar to make the sticks stick together. That doesn't sound like a pretty sure building. Yeah?
Isn't
Shinar?
Shinar the descendants of Ham?
Well, we're going to see that it's talking about Babel. So we remember whose kingdom Babel was. So it was the descendants of Ham, yeah. It doesn't really tell us where they split apart, right? It doesn't tell us where the descendants of Ham left the descendants of the other brothers, but that's a good observation that we are talking about the descendants of Ham here. They were the ones who dwelt in Shinar. So, see if I can find my place here again. So they used slime for mortar. In verse 4, it says, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. Now, when they settled in Shinar, do you know what their plan was? Yeah?
Not scatter and build a tower.
Exactly. And they were going to build a tower. It wasn't just going to be any old tower. They wanted to use their bricks out of mud and their slime, and they were going to build a tower to heaven. They were going to build a tower all the way to heaven. And, I think this was because they were prideful. They wanted to build their own way to God. They wanted to make themselves so strong and special that they could reach to wherever they wanted to. Now tell me, is that a sure foundation? You think that's a sure foundation if they're just going to build themselves as a tower of mud and slime and build it all the way to heaven? Is there any amount of building that we can do that will build our way to God? No, there's no amount of building that we can do to build our way to God. The Bible teaches us that it's by faith in Jesus Christ. It's by trusting in God and trusting in Jesus that we have salvation, that we have assurance of eternal life. And there's a lot of people who try and build. There's a lot of people who build. They might not use mud and slime, but they build with works. And they want to make sure they go to church every Sunday. And if they go to church, they'll have just the right amount of church building blocks to build themselves their way to heaven. But there's no amount of building that we can do with anything, not with good works, not with praying. None of those things are good enough. It's by faith in Jesus Christ and his finished work. That's trusting in Jesus Christ and trusting in that sure foundation. And that's how we have eternal life. That's how we have hope. In verse 6, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Can you imagine that? God saw them. They were united. They were one people. And he came down and he saw what they were doing. He saw that building, even though it wasn't a very sure foundation. But he said, nothing is going to be restrained from them. They are one. And he didn't like what he's seen. He said, in verse 7, he's going to solve this problem. He says, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So God was going to confound their language. And this is the origin of all the different language. This is the fourth generation. So before that, they were all of one speech. But in verse 8, it says, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. So we often wonder, when we look at the world, how there's so many different people, and they're all over the earth, and how would they get there? That's a pretty big question. But you know how they got there? It was a work of the Lord. At Babel, when everyone was of one speech and they were united together, God, he didn't want it. They were pursuing the wrong goals. They were trying to build their own way. So he decided to scatter them. This was a work of the Lord, and he scattered them all over the earth. And he confounded their language, and that's where all the different languages come from. You know, I imagine that scene. Can you imagine everyone's together building that big tower, and then all of a sudden, just like that, somebody's telling you to put a brick somewhere, but you can't understand a word he's saying. It sounds like a foreign language. It sounds to me like when somebody speaks speech to me. I just have no idea what's going on. It's just clicks and hums, and also it would have been all sorts of different languages. No one would have understood each other. So one person was saying, take this brick and put it over here. Well, he had no idea what he was talking about. He probably took that brick and put it right back on his head. Who knows, right? But you know what I think would have happened? Well, it says that they got together with the people that spoke the same languages. That's what it sounds like. So when the people, they tried to find other people who spoke the same languages. They were probably running around in a panic, just yelling, trying to find someone who could understand them. And when they found some people who could speak together, they grouped up together, and once they had a nice group, they just went. They scattered. That's kind of an interesting event in the scripture, that's for sure. It says, therefore is the name of it called Babel. Whenever I think of that, I think of Babel, because I just imagine all the babbling that was going on when that happened. But it says, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. Babel actually means confusion. I'm sure there was a lot of that. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now we're going to read in verse 10. We're going to try and go through this quick so I don't take too much time. Now these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years. Now, who remembers those numbers? Who can tell me how old Arphaxad was? Yes? That was Noah. Good. That was good remembering. That's how old Noah was. I was just going to ask that one. So Arphaxad, who remembers how old Arphaxad was, or who can do the math? He was, well, we'll read it one more time. So Shem was, I'm sorry, I actually gave you the wrong name. We're talking about Shem. Arphaxad was his son. So Shem was 100 years old, and then he had a son. Now Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad his son, 500 years. So he was 100, had a son, and then he lived 500 years after that. Who can tell me how old he was? Raquel? 600 years old. Now, was he as old as his father? No. Not even close, right? Noah was 950 years old. You know, so something happened after the flood, and their age was being taken away. It was actually a work of the Lord. Their age was being taken away. So now he was significantly younger than his father. And now Arphaxad was his son. It says Arphaxad lived 35 years, so that's 35 years. Make sure you remember that number, kids. 35 years, he begat Selah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403 years. So he lived 403 plus 35. How old is that? Yeah. 438. Good job. Math lessons. Don't you kids love it? You thought you were going to leave it at school, but not today. 438 years old. So he was 438 years old. Is that as old as Noah? Not even close. That's about half the age of Noah. Half the age, a little bit less than half as old as his grandfather got. So this is Noah's grandson. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. There's a few more of these generations, and they were all about that age, 400 years. Now, so already their lives have been cut in half. Now, just want to make sure I have the right verse. We're going to read in verse 17. And Eber lived after he begot Peleg 430 years, and begat sons and daughters. So he's already in his 400s too. He was an old man. Now, who remembers Peleg? We talked about him in the last chapter. Do you remember Peleg? Something happened in Peleg's life. Do you remember what it was? Yeah? Yes, it says the earth was divided. Now, it says, and Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. I don't know if I'm saying these names right, kids. You'll have to ask your parents, because I have no idea. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants here. But verse 19, and Peleg lived after he begat Reu, I don't know, 209 years. So, he was 30 years old, had a son, and after his son, he lived 209 years. How old was he? 239 years old. Oh, you look disappointed you didn't get to do math. I'm sorry. We might be all out of math questions for the day, though. So 239 years old. Now, if his father lived to about 460, and he lived to about 239, that's about half, isn't it? The earth was divided. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know the result of what happened, that they lived about half as long as their fathers do. Basically, everyone after Peleg they didn't live over 200 years. And it wasn't long after that that people only started to living to about 100 years old. So God took the long life away from people that they once had. So we're going to skip ahead, and we're just going to read the last few verses, and we're going to talk about somebody that we all are probably very familiar with. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father in the land of his nativity, in the Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. So now we're talking about Abram. We all know Abram isn't the name we're very familiar with, but we know God gives him a new name. Who knows that new name? Let's see if we can get somebody new here. Who knows Abram's new name? Somebody who hasn't answered a lot of questions. Yeah?
Abraham.
That's right, Abraham. Verse 30, but Sarai was barren. She had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from the Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came, well, before we get too far, one of Ham's sons was named Canaan. Now Abram was leaving the Ur of the Chaldees and with his whole family, and they were going into the land of Canaan. This is Ham's descendants. This is the descendants of Ham. Now we know that these aren't very good guys, so he's probably going to get himself into some trouble. But this is actually, we're going to read in the next chapter eventually. We're going to get to read a little bit more about Abram, but it says, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So Terah only lived to 205 years. Well, children, that's actually all we wanted to get through today. You can head back to your seat. Thank you for listening so well.